Hi, everybody. I'm Kathleen McGoy, and I'm here with Lindsey Pointer. We are the authors of the Little Book of Restorative Teaching Tools, and we're so excited to be joining the RJ World Conference 2022. I want to start with just a little bit about what you can expect from our presentation. So in 2020, we talked about some of the foundational aspects of restorative pedagogy and made a case about why it's important to teach restorative practices in a way that aligns with restorative values and principles. So today in this session, we're not going to repeat those same foundational components. We're going to go right into sharing some of our most recent games and activities with you. But please go back, check our YouTube channel for the 2020 session if you'd like to hear about, setting that foundation for why this matters and why we're teaching this way. A little bit about me, my background in restorative justice goes back to about 2013. I worked at a nonprofit called Longmont Community Justice Partnership in Longmont, Colorado, that facilitates community restorative justice programs in partnership with police. Police can make direct referrals to the community model for both youth and adults. And in that program, we did a lot of training of volunteers and educators, law enforcement officers, many professionals looking for ways to integrate restorative tools to their context and environment. So that is what brought me to this work. And today, another piece I just want to emphasize is that we are talking about this particular area of growth in the restorative theme or in the restorative field. So recognizing that restorative practices are spreading beyond just restorative justice in the criminal legal context and schools. And one way that shows up in my world now, I have left the nonprofit role that I was in just a year ago to launch a training and consulting company called Kathleen McGoy and Associates. And one of my primary areas of service is working with workplaces that want to incorporate restorative practices into the organization's culture. So how can any company, nonprofit, even a community group, a church, bring in tools to start building and prioritizing relationships and also having tools to address conflict in a way that centers repair and reintegration? And I'd love to pass it off to you, Lindsey.
Thanks. So I'm Lindsey Pointer, and similar to Kathleen, I have a practitioner background, also worked at Longmont Community Justice Partnership, had the great pleasure of working with Kathleen there, and then left LCJP to do a Fulbright scholarship and a PhD in New Zealand studying restorative justice. And now am at Vermont Law School. I'm an assistant professor and also work with the National Center on Restorative Justice, which is a partnership between Vermont Law School, the University of Vermont, University of San Diego, and the U.S. Office of Justice Programs. And in terms of the context that I find myself most often using these games and activities for teaching restorative justice now, I use them quite a bit in the classroom with students who are either pursuing a master's in restorative justice at Vermont Law School or are JD students, pursuing a law degree who are interested in learning more about restorative justice as part of their studies. And in finding, that using these really participatory experiential activities is a great way for students to be able to experience restorative approaches more fully in the classroom. I've also been using many of these games and activities recently. One of our projects under the National Center is providing restorative justice education in prisons. And so I'm working along with Professor Kathy Fox in a women's correctional facility here in Vermont, offering a restorative justice course to the women who are incarcerated there. And it's been excellent using the activities in that context because they're flexible and creative and don't require a lot of equipment. You don't have to have that PowerPoint slide up. You can really play with tape and paper and materials that are easy to bring and have anywhere. And then that equalizing impact, which we talk about more in our first RJ World video from 2020, but just ways to break down what is often experienced as a power dynamic or a hierarchy in a classroom, and instead cultivate a space where everyone is really learning from each other. And I just notice in particular the impact of shifting the classroom structure in that way in some of these criminal justice contexts. So we're excited to share some of our new games and activities with you all today, and hope that you'll continue to follow along as we develop more games and activities all the time based on the needs that we hear from folks following our work. So I'll pass back to you, Kathleen.
Thanks. Yeah, so a note on that is, since the Little Book was published in March 2020, we have released a new game or activity almost every single month, and those are all available for free on restorativeteachingtools.com. And we have done our best to make the games responsive to needs that we learn about in the community. So within the broad field of restorative justice practices, we receive feedback from other practitioners or just track what's happening in terms of current events, recognizing that you all, those of you who are bringing these practices to your community, will need to be responsive to what's happening in the world when you introduce restorative tools into your workplace, your classroom, into a setting of incarceration, wherever you're bringing these tools with community volunteers. We want you to be able to draw connections to what is happening, not just in the immediate world around you, but kind of, the broader scope of justice issues that affect our work. So please feel free to sit back and just listen to this session, knowing that each game and activity that we described today has detailed instructions available for free at any moment for you on restorativeteachingtools.com. So you can just listen today and then reference those instructions when you want to bring those games and activities to your community. A brief piece that I'm going to touch on before we get into describing those games is an aspect of our book that we just didn't want to leave out, which is how important it is, not just what you do with your learning community, but how you do it. So we know what it looks like when restorative justice or restorative practices are delivered or implemented in a way that is not congruent with restorative values. And so we really want to call to action the importance of you as whether you identify as a facilitator, a trainer, an instructor, a professor, the importance for you to also be alive in some of those values and practices, being self-reflective, being vulnerable about the fact that you will bring bias and expectations and assumptions to your role. What can you do to be accountable to the learning experience alongside your learning community? We give a few specific tools and practices that you can follow to facilitate your own experience of self-reflection and what to do to really reflect on your role as a guide, as a facilitator, and bringing your own process of learning, which often requires vulnerability, into the learning experience. So really want to emphasize that this is a dynamic process. And we want to encourage you to bring that attitude to all of your engagement as a restorative practitioner.
So in terms of how we want to structure the rest of this session, we're going to be kind of interviewing each other as a way to explain or highlight 4 recent games and activities that you might wish to implement for learning needs in your community. So for each of the activities or games, we'll offer a brief snapshot of when you might use it, what the purpose of the activity is, how you play it, a brief description, knowing, like Kathleen said, that you can find more detailed instructions always available on the website, restorativeteachingtools.com, and then outcomes that we've observed in using this game or activity in different communities. So that's the brief snapshot that we will provide for each of the 4 games we'll highlight today.
And we're going to keep going in this back and forth sort of dynamic, interviewing each other, because we've each had different experiences using these games and activities. And so we just like to share with you those bullet points that Lindsey mentioned in each of our experiences. So I have the opportunity to interview Lindsey first about an activity that we refer to as "What Did I Need?" So Lindsey, would you tell us a little bit more about when you've used this game, how it's played, and the outcomes you've observed?
Yes. So Kathleen mentioned already that many of our games and activities are responsive to what's happening in communities we're in communication with, or bigger picture in the world. And a lot has happened in the world in the last couple years since our book was published in 2020, including a global pandemic. And so this game really came out of this sudden shift that we experienced, where all of a sudden we were asked to do a lot more on Zoom or other video platforms than we were previously. And so it arose out of this need for, how can we have something that's interactive, that prompts self-reflection, but that can be used on Zoom with a really large group. So think webinar, but think about how to make this more interactive in understanding basic tenets of the restorative philosophy.
And how do we play this game?
So how we play, it's on Zoom, and it's making use of the chat function on Zoom. And so this is really good to use at the very beginning of a Zoom session, because it has a relationship building component built into it. So obviously, if it's a large group on Zoom, it's difficult to have, say, a circle process as a chance for people to get to know each other. So start by asking everyone to find the chat function on Zoom and start with just a few relationship building questions, which allow people to kind of meet each other and feel more engaged in the space and connected, and also has the very practical function of allowing people to familiarize themselves with the chat function, which will be essential to the rest of the activity. So we like to ask some really basic questions, maybe a first one of, just how many siblings do you have? And then it's actually just typing a number into the chat and clicking send, but then right away you're with a really low barrier to entry, getting that engagement from folks. Maybe the next question is something that requires a little bit more vulnerability and sharing, but is still fun, like what's the most interesting job you've ever had? So 2 or 3 relationship building questions. You as facilitator would then be reading off some of the responses that are coming through in the chat as a way to kind of liven it up and show that that those responses are being seen, but everyone can also see them in the chat as well. And then indicate that you're shifting gears and ask the first kind of substantive question around reflecting on a time that you, as a member of your community, became aware of a crime being committed. Or if you're not doing this in a criminal justice context, you could also say a significant incident of harm. What were your needs in that moment as a community member? People then respond in the chat, continue to read those off. And what you'll notice right away is a lot of commonality in the responses that are coming through. People mention things like, I needed to know that me and my family were safe. I needed to know why this happened. I wanted to know that it wouldn't happen again. Things like that are common community needs in the wake of crime or significant harm. Note commonalities. If there are themes that feel true to you that you don't see coming through in the chat, share that. It's good. It's a good moment to be vulnerable and engage in the process authentically. Say, I remember when I heard about a crime being committed in my neighborhood, I was really worried about, what this would mean for my kids being able to walk down the street to the playground. Do a little bit of your own sharing. Next question is asking people to then reflect on a time that they experienced significant harm. So maybe they were the victim of a crime, or maybe this was some other time that someone harmed them. What were your needs in that moment? And again, people respond in the chat. Read them out as they come. Note commonalities. Again, there will be many. People have needs for their questions to be answered, again, needs for safety, needs to know why this happened, to know that it wouldn't happen again to them or anyone else. A lot of common needs, again, arise. And then final question, asking people to reflect back on a time that they caused significant harm, maybe committing a crime, or maybe this was another time in their personal life that they caused significant harm. And again, responding in the chat, what were your needs in that moment? And once again, you'll see many common threads in those responses. So then just through going through that activity, you're going to make a really powerful point around the needs that emerge for individuals in a post-crime situation or post-significant harm situation, which is central to restorative justice, because what we're trying to do is provide processes, ways of justice making that are more responsive to individual and community needs. And so highlight that. As a debrief, you can either have people debrief by making contributions in the chat, or you can ask folks to unmute and debrief verbally, asking what their takeaways were from going through that process. And people will reflect on generally the ways that they see the needs that were surfaced reflected in restorative processes, how those so often aren't met by more conventional or mainstream criminal legal responses. And we'll note the kind of common human justice needs that have emerged as well.
Great. And is there anything you want to share about outcomes that you've observed from this activity?
Yeah, I think, maybe this takes the place, or at least, and I think how we've used it, it takes the place of like starting with that, what is restorative justice attempt as at a definition, and instead creates this opportunity to ground folks in like story and experience, and that kind of like visceral, like more embodied experience of what did I need and what might others be needing after something significant and harmful has happened. And it just creates a more kind of living, breathing understanding of what restorative justice is than you could ever get from, some attempt at a definition on a slide. I've noticed that impact when we use this activity, and it just livens up the Zoom calls, which is very important.
Definitely. Yeah, I've used this one a lot in both groups that are exploring restorative justice implementation and groups seeking to bring restorative practices into the workplace. So I've just framed the questions around a time that you experienced hurt or harm in the workplace. And what I've noticed is by moving through those three different perspectives or those three different roles, it also brings to light that we've all been in all three roles. I think often people are thinking about like, oh yeah, this new thing could work in this one scenario where I needed to do something a certain way. And then this activity helps place myself in like, oh, right, there was a time when I caused harm and there was a time that I was hurt. And wow, this process actually meets my needs in each of those different roles and is, a really direct experience without actually going through restorative justice yourself in the moment. It serves as a really powerful introduction.
Absolutely. Great. Should we go to our second activity?
Do it.
Which is around understanding the first harm. So Kathleen, can you tell us a little bit about when this activity would be used?
Yes, this activity needs to be used all the time. It is an activity that for those of you who are familiar with the book Colorizing Restorative Justice, you will recognize this phrase of understanding the first harm from the chapter written by Edward Valandra. If you haven't read Colorizing Restorative Justice, we highly, highly encourage you to make it the next book on your reading list. It is central to working in the field of restorative practices at this time and for forever. And so this book is important to use around this piece of many restorative practitioners are identifying the indigenous roots. We all need to be identifying the roots of where restorative justice, as we call it today, comes from, and honoring and respecting those roots. And yet there's also this dissonance if we're just superficially referencing it without truly internalizing what that means for our lives today as restorative practitioners and the responsibility that we hold to make repairs, making repairs to the best of our ability to Native and Indigenous peoples from around the world who have suffered violence, genocide, and oppression and continue to suffer in these systems of dominance. So this is something that we would encourage you to bring in at any time. We introduced this activity along with Indigenous Peoples Day in October. So that was a time. Is it in October? Did I get that right?
I think so. I'd have to look back at when this, I think it was
October. But it doesn't matter. Any month is really important. And so what we did was relate the importance of this recognition with an activity that Lindsey and I had participated in, led by a group called Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples, based out of Boulder, Colorado, the Boulder area, which is where Lindsey and I met. This group offers an online experience called Roots of Injustice, Seeds of Change. And it is an interactive exploration of the history of suffering and oppression of Native peoples in North America. And when Lindsey and I experienced this activity, there was so much that we realized that we didn't know about this history. And again, the activity leads people through a really visceral experience of what would it be like to actually have not just land taken away, but your rights taken away, your access to food, your access to family and community. And so what we did with that activity is tried to build on an additional restorative element. So the way that we invite you to participate is first to sign up and engage with the group Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. And we'll show you their website in just a moment. And then our activity builds upon that. So the first step would be to do their activity. And then we were saying, you know, what's the next step in accountability, or what's the next step in integrating what I learned from that workshop and taking it one step further. So we provide a number of prompts. Each of these are things that you could do as an individual, or you could do it in community, which would be even more powerful for some of us. But we wanted to make it something that you could do either way. There's no barrier to participating. And the practice follows that restorative arc. So now that you've learned more about the impacts and the harms, what are some of the ways that you can commit to reparative action? So we have some open-ended questions prompting you to think about reparative action you can make. And then there's also an accountability prompt. So instead of just maybe thinking about it once and then saying, okay, well, you know, that was maybe a really difficult or enlightening experience and I kind of completed it and now I'm done. We encourage you to create a system of accountability to return to those reparative actions over time. Lindsey, do you want to pull up that website so we can?
Yeah, let me share this. So just highlighting here that the next public online offering of their Zoom version of this workshop is on April 24th. So if you'd like to register for that right away, you can, but otherwise you can go to their website to find other upcoming offerings as a chance to have this experience, which again, we highly recommend. So Kathleen, what outcomes have you observed or experienced from this activity?
Yeah, I want to not forget to mention that I'll answer the question, but I want to mention that they do ask for a suggested donation. So please support this community and our colleagues at Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. They do incredible work. Just want to give you a heads up that there is a request to do an energy exchange through a financial contribution when you participate in their workshop. And the outcomes, I would say, are just really offering one way that we can respond to Edward Valandra's call to action again, to say, what can we really commit to in understanding that first harm and taking on responsibility to make repairs to the best of our ability, to go beyond that sort of surface level honoring and recognizing where restorative practices come from, and say, as part of this privilege that I have to be working in this field, I also carry the responsibility to keep the conversation alive and not just talk about it, but actually make meaningful reparations. So that's the outcome that I've seen, is that it is offering a community of learners a way to go one step further, instead of possibly, learning about this, possibly feeling shut down, like it's too big of a harm, I don't know what to do about it. We're trying to offer a way beyond that to say, no, you can make meaningful reparation.
Absolutely. I might just add, I feel like a big impetus for this activity was just our own needs around, having read Edward Valandra's chapter and participated in this really impactful exercise with Towards Right Relationships, and feeling a desire for some structure ourselves around, like, how can we keep going with this, and intentionally bring the restorative paradigm to bear on our own learning and attempts at making repair. So just to name that's a personal impact on this one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our third activity is our needs and feelings iceberg.
Yes.
So, Lindsey, I'm going to ask you to describe when you like to use this one.
Yeah. So this, and actually, Kathleen, do you mind pulling up the visual? I think it'll be helpful in explaining this one. This activity is really a way to help people understand how needs and feelings are at the root of all behavior, but particularly problematic behavior. So learning that really essential restorative skill of viewing a behavior through the lens of the unmet need that it's attempting to fulfill, and how can we find, pro-social ways collaboratively for those needs to be fulfilled. And so we offer this iceberg visual. I also want to mention this activity is particularly fun because it was collaboratively designed with a group of participants who attended our collaborative design workshop at the last RJ World Conference. So this is an activity that has its origins in the RJ World community. And we had so much fun designing it with the group that came together. And this was the need that was identified by that group as a learning need, was, how to really talk about and understand needs at the root of behavior. And the iceberg was the metaphor that came out of that conversation, and talking about how, what we see above the waterline is the behavior. At the waterline, where sometimes we can see them and sometimes we can't, are the feelings. So sometimes you see these like physical manifestations of feelings, but a lot of feelings you can't see. It's at that waterline. But then what's deep below the waterline is the needs, and generally the unmet needs that are at the root of that behavior. So what we do with this visual in this activity is either have, if it's an online, workshop or class or training, or offering, having a slide like this that can be filled in real time, or if it's in person. This is one of the activities I used recently at the Women's Correctional Facility, and I used masking tape to make a giant picture of a iceberg on the ground in the middle of the circle and the water line. And so had this big picture of the visual that we were then able to engage with together. We draw on nonviolent communication resources in this activity. So what we do then is provide a case scenario, and then divide the group into two groups, one focused on needs and one focused on feelings. And their responsibility is to imagine and identify what needs and what feelings might be at the root of the kind of case study statement that they just heard. I like to use, I have these They're called grok cards that are just a deck of feeling words and a deck of needs. And so, for example, when we do it in person with a shared physical visual in the middle, after the groups have had time to identify which feelings and needs they think are at play, they then take the cards, take those words and actually place them on the iceberg and create this kind of collective visual in the middle of the circle of what might be going on for this person. And what's really interesting about that kind of physicality component and this ability to kind of collectively mold this shared visual is people end up really organically doing things like, well, this need is connected to this feeling, so I'm going to put this right here, or this need is way down low, like we were barely able to identify that one, but if we go into the depths of what we think is really happening, we think it's this need. And that kind of the visual, the metaphor then provides this like multi-layered way to talk about what's going on in this case and to really flesh out that deeper understanding of how needs are at the root of behavior. Kathleen, do you mind talking about how this has been adapted recently for a feedback activity?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So one of the ways that I've kind of expanded on this, and we have specific instructions for this version, is, I just realized that in many workplaces, there are expectations for people to be giving and receiving feedback without many tools or mechanisms for how to do that. And so we adapted the original activity to suggest what this could look like for groups that want to think about centering needs and feelings within a feedback context. And something that I'll just pull up real quickly that Lindsey and I discovered as a valuable expansion of the iceberg metaphor is that you can actually use them side by side and think about the incident of feedback, or I'm sorry, the incident that you're giving feedback around, and put yourself in one iceberg and go through a reflective process of thinking through, what are my feelings and possible unmet needs that are leading to this moment of having this feedback conversation? And then doing the same as an inquiry, a reflective inquiry for the other person, and putting that on the other iceberg as an empathy building process. What might be some of the needs that are driving their behavior? And found that to be a really, again, another visual. Sometimes there's shared needs that we hadn't even been aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's, I would say that's a cool outcome of both versions of this activity is, to an extent, it's an empathy building, right? You're imagining, you're putting yourself in the shoes of someone else when you're filling out that iceberg for another person, regardless of context, which I think is a great activity. Ultimately, you'd want to use skillful question asking to find out what is really going on for someone. There's only so much that we can, imagine about another person's experience. But that self-reflection component, I think, comes naturally in both versions of, what does my iceberg look like? What are some behaviors that I haven't yet considered through a feelings and needs framework?
Yeah. Thank you so much for expanding on those outcomes.
Yeah, great. Well, we have one more to talk through, elephant ears. So can you tell us a little bit about when elephant ears might be used?
Yes. So elephant ears, I also like to call it listening between the lines. I was working with one client where I thought if I called it elephant ears, they might not receive it. So just also want to offer that when you're introducing these activities, feel free to adapt the name to make it something that is still true to the activity, but thinking about the audience and their receptivity. So this is an activity that is really about how to be listening in a way that helps you to respond to someone using 4 different tools or approaches, which are validations, affirmations, reflections, and reframes. So of course, we really want to encourage active listening, period, really being present and listening. But one of the things that we've noticed in this, especially in restorative justice practices, when people are facilitating, there's this kind of tendency to go towards the next question, right? Like, especially when you're trying to elicit the story of what someone's experienced and they're sharing very vulnerably. Just going to the next question does not necessarily support the speaker's feeling of being heard. And so we distilled down what are the nuances? What are the differences between, especially those first three, a validation, affirmation, and reflection? How do you actually craft responses in each of those approaches? And then what is the likely outcome or impact of using each of those? Reframe is a little bit in its own category, right? Because it's a reflective statement that also helps recontextualize what somebody said, that often is trying to kind of place it in a different light, or maybe it's listening and reflecting back a need, kind of going back to our iceberg in a way that helps somebody get more insight, or maybe helps kind of diffuse what could be a charged statement. So that recontextualizing piece. When to use it is really, again, anybody who's engaging either as a restorative justice facilitator or someone who's just learning to use restorative tools like a restorative conversation for a one-on-one conflict. This elephant ears activity helps really build a complementary skill set to make any of those restorative processes more successful, builds empathy and rapport, and builds out like this really important advanced skill set. So something that we learned working with volunteers is we were giving them feedback like, oh, try using more reflective statements, or, oh, that was a great validation. And we were saying those things, but not actually giving them more information about what that means, more of a nuanced look. The way the activity works is, again, providing some scenarios, and then people working either in pairs or in a group of 3. You share the scenario and then you draw a card. Like if Lindsey and I were doing this together, Lindsey would read the scenario and then hold up 4 cards. I would pull a card, and the card is either going to say reflection, validation, affirmation, or reframe. And then it's my job to try to come up with a statement that fits that approach in response to the scenario. And so this is another one, we've talked previously about how to up the intensity or up sort of like the pressure within these games. This is one that's a great example. You can either have your pairs or teams working together collaboratively, because this is a challenging new skill for many people. Or if your learners have become more advanced, you can put a little bit more pressure on by saying like, you have to come up with it on your own. You can make it either something that they write down, or they just have to say verbally, which is how it might be more in the role of a circle keeper or a facilitator. And then you can also make a time pressure element too, if you want to really up the ante and build some intensity.
And what outcomes have you observed in using this game?
The first time that I saw this game used, I saw people really lighting up. It's like they had heard these terms thrown around a lot, like, oh, like I was saying, like, oh, reflection, a validation, but like really keen in on, for example, an affirmation is something that draws on the strengths of the speaker. And so it doesn't mean that you're always going to be listening to someone and thinking like, am I going to validate or affirm? What am I going to do? But what the outcome that we noticed is sometimes people were like, oh, I'm doing this. I already use a lot of validations. I wonder if I could practice doing this strengths-based piece and make them more affirming. And so it was a self-reinforcing practice. They were getting more insight about what they already often were doing, and then thinking about how to expand or deepen their communication skills with more intention.
That's great. It occurs to me, I mean, these aren't easy skills, like, and it's a kind of nerve-wracking thing when you're first learning them, and in that kind of facility, it's still nerve-wracking practicing these things in communities of other facilitators. And so having that playfulness, that ability to turn up the intensity, create such a inviting space to playfully engage in that learning and deeper understanding of each of those tools, where you almost don't have time to worry about, what you're saying because you're so caught up in the game of it.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to make a quick reference to another game that is a great example of that, which is called Race to Reframe. This is also on our website, and it becomes just a really fun, dynamic, engaging activity because there is the time element, and it's specifically about reframing charge statements. So just want to bring your attention to that if that's something you really want to key in on.
Absolutely. Along those lines, we did want to share our website just briefly. We've mentioned it several times, but restorative-teaching-tools.com. You can sign up here for the game of the month, so it comes right to your email. You can also find all of the games that we've mentioned today, as well as many more. As we were describing these, I kept thinking, oh, we should have included that game, this game. There's increasingly a lot of great material on here, so we encourage you to check it out. And sign up for that game of the month. You can also follow us on social media. And we also just encourage you to check out our book, The Little Book of Restorative Teaching Tools. It has a lot more of that kind of foundational why teach in this way, why restorative pedagogy, why paying attention to this alignment with restorative values, and why our games and activities is a great way to do that. Along with some really helpful chapters on how to design your own games and activities, design trainings and educational experiences in this way, and how to prepare to teach some of what Kathleen mentioned at the beginning, that kind of personal work that goes into teaching or facilitating in this way. So we encourage you to check it out and to be in touch with us. We love hearing from people who are using or exploring the restorative teaching tools, or have an idea or an activity they want to share. It's really turned into a great community of people, and we so value anytime we get an outreach from folks who are finding this work helpful or have an idea that they want to share. Anything we're missing?
I think just in the case that you're watching this before July 2022, we want to invite you to come participate in an activity where you will build your own game or activity, which is at the NACRJ conference in Chicago, July 2022. We're offering a workshop then. And if you're watching this video at a later date, please check our website, because we are planning on mapping out some in-person workshops now that hopefully we're seeing the opportunity to get together in person continue to grow. And so we'd love for you to know what we're offering when we're offering it, and to reach out and connect with us. As Lindsey said, the learning process, we are learning all the time. And so the more our community grows, the richer that our work and our offerings become, and we can elevate or uplift your voice, your needs for your community, and collaborate in building something together.
Great. Well, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the conference.